So working with people like Mark and Rob and Jessica's really brought in skill sets that we don't necessarily have within Oxfam to help us address these issues. Now, the problem that we tend to face is we work in places where sustainability of water and sanitation systems is really challenged by a lack of financial viability. In a nutshell, it costs money to run these systems, and we tend to work in areas where the cost of service delivery tends to be quite high, and either ability or willingness to pay is quite low. So what do we do in these places? We've done loads of interventions over the years to try to drive efficiency of water and sanitation systems, bring the costs down, etc. We do tend to have lots of small scale projects, pilots. They don't always necessarily scale. Why not? Well, to illustrate that, before I hand it over to the others, I just want to show a couple of graphs that kind of demonstrate that. So this first one, this is looking at what's a typical water system that we work on in the northern arid lands of Kenya. Very dry, very poor, very sparsely populated areas. This is showing the cumulative net income of a small water system over 20 years. Now, this is a system where we've already put in the most efficient, cost-effective solar-powered water pumping system, automated water dispensers where you can do digital payment through mobile money, drive down your overhead costs. So from a technical point of view, it's quite efficient. This is considering that the entire capital expenditure has been subsidized already by us. So we're only looking at recovery of operating expenses here. And you can see over 20 years for a small water system, with 35% non-revenue water, which is typically what we deal with there, we don't even hit a break-even point. We're losing about $200 over those 20 years, yeah? Now, if you go to the next slide, this is the same water system. This is if we could get non-revenue water down to 20%, which would be amazing in these places. We could have a cumulative net income, again, with all your CapEx subsidized, around $1,400. Not a big return there. If you go to the next one, and I think Jessica's going to touch on this later, this shows some of our work in Nepal. So I know it's a lot of numbers here, but if you look at the ones in circles, these are looking at two different sizes of water systems that we tend to work with. If you look at that first one, it's total revenues per year coming in. The smaller systems make around $2,000. The other one's pulling around 15. That looks pretty healthy, right? But once you factor in your capital maintenance expenditure, your long-term operation maintenance, the small ones, kind of surprisingly, eke out a profit of almost $500 per year. Our bigger systems that we thought were doing okay are actually losing about $3,600 per year. Now, what we've seen is we can make these lose a lot less money. We likely won't make them profitable. So how do we invest in these places? So that's where we really partnered with Jessica and Lefil, is really helping us figure out how far can we push market-based approaches in these types of areas. And is there any way that we can work with the private sector to kind of drive efficiency, incentivize them to actually do it? Rob has really challenged our thinking on how we use public funding and how we can make it work harder and actually incentivize it to invest in these types of places. And Mark, I think, has a really interesting example of essentially setting up a water enterprise in a place that I don't think anyone else would actually be insane enough to invest in, and that's Eastern Congo. And I think they've somehow made the numbers work out on it. So I think it's a really great experience to actually learn from, but the time that took to actually develop that also.
Thanks, Tony. That sounds absolutely, I mean, I hate using this word, but that sounds absolutely insane. Even as an investor myself, you know, I've looked at these models, and it's difficult to make the case of you know, driving capital into this space, specifically looking for ROI. So taking that into consideration, I know, Jessica, you've been working with us with Oxfam. You've worked with us in Nepal. You've worked with us in Kenya. Specifically in Nepal, you're working with us on developing a model that specifically addresses what Tom was saying. You know, the idea of actually lowering the loss, basically, not really generating a positive ROI, but to really sort of, as we say, stop the bleeding. So taking that into consideration, how far do you think, Jessica, we can really go with this quote unquote market-based approach? Hello?
Excuse me, it was the classical, I forgot to unmute myself. So thank you, Oscar. Very excited to contribute to this conversation. I think my homework for today was really to a little bit open up everyone's perspective on what the problem truly is and how whether we're really trying to solve it from the right angle. And so what I would like is to throw a few facts and ideas at the audience to perhaps make everyone look beyond the usual explanations. So this is going to be my role today. It's going to be, I'm going to be the little kid in the street who says, "Oh, the emperor has no clothes." And are we really sure that all what we're saying is the truth, and that we're not building on assumptions that we somehow take for granted, but they are not? So let me just throw a few things at you. It really struck me. It really strikes me each time I go and see a rural water scheme, to see how ingrained that belief is that water user committees is the only and best solution. I think it's the standard that was imposed by the development community on the development world. And I just wonder if this standard was just, a convenient solution, or like a convenient lack of solution, or something really thought through. And let me give you an example. This is, you see that, let me give you the example of, or let me ask people in the audience, who has ever lived in a building whereby the building itself was supposed to be managed by the people living in the building? So, replacing the bulbs in the corridors, making sure the trash, was disposed of properly, hiring that cleaning lady to do the stairs once a week. Who has ever lived in such a building where the management of the building was left to the owner tenants? Well, I did for 2 years in Paris, in a very posh area of town, where everyone in the building was extremely well educated, quite rich, with a lot of free time, because the average age in the building, I would say, was 50 to 60 years old. And this is the picture of what the basement, on the left side, of what the basement would look like regularly, right? I know it's Paris, I know it's France, but still, right? So, and there were kind of all kinds of notices on the wall, alerting people this was not okay, and so on. And I'm just wondering what would have happened if the roof would have collapsed. Seriously, if we could not get even the garbage under control, what about a major investment, or painting the facade, or whatever? So I'm just would like to, there is this general myth saying that, it should be, the community should own it, right? And if there's no ownership, they will not look after it. Well, I think it's just a, water user committee or community-based models are just a very convenient way for NGOs to finish their work, get paid, and then move on and leave the problem behind them to the communities and to the local authorities for them to manage. And this brings me to my second slide, which is the slide where I want to debunk the myth that there is not enough money around. Say, there's always, saying, oh, we need to, raise X billion of dollars to reach the, the SDG, like the WASH target by 2020 or 2030, and there is not enough money, and we need to find money. Well, my point is that perhaps we could do, go back to the previous slide. My point would be that we could do probably way more with the money we already have. So on the left side, this is Kenya. We did a quick math for Kenya. Go back to previous slide. We did a quick math for Kenya. You would need for Kenya close to $800 million just to add and maintain water infrastructure for the full country. This is only with donors focusing on paying for CapEx. If donors would allocate 7% of that CapEx to grant to pay for OpEx, we could reach the same result, but saving 226 million in the process. So again, there is a myth that we should only pay for CapEx and it should be the locals figuring out a way for the OpEx. Well, I'm not sure, and I think we do that just because it's more convenient. But the truth is that we waste a huge amount of money doing that. Next slide. I also want to question how this money is invested into particular schemes. We say that private sectors have got cold feet and they are not interested, in these difficult schemes. Well, let's look at what kind of job we do, because it doesn't look very thought through, right? You have basically what the columns show is the CapEx per household and the OpEx per household of various water schemes installed by mostly Oxfam, by the way. And you see huge discrepancies, right? And some schemes basically cost 40 times more to maintain and to install than others. In a world that is where resources are limited, my question is, are you really, really sure that people in this area, where the bars are are you really, really sure that it was worthwhile sacrificing 39 other schemes to build that one, which anyway will not be sustainable because the CapEx to run that scheme is just so preposterously high that it's bound to fail from day one. So I'm again with a view of, are we really sure we're investing this money smartly, even taking into account things like vulnerability and others. Next slide. Next slide. And then the following, that brings the question on, can we try to fix this, right? And how can we trigger the right behavior, ensuring that all what we do builds towards increased sustainability of these schemes. And I was actually reviewing, to prepare for this presentation, I was reviewing a payment by result scheme by DFID, which is, I would imagine, I would say that DFID is quite a sophisticated development agency, right? And so I was looking at one of the payment by result schemes by DFID for Oxfam in Nepal, and I was like, are they at least incentivizing Oxfam on the right stuff so that Oxfam focuses really truly on sustainability, long-term value? And I was trying to pick up some of the KPIs that Oxfam uses to actually track whether they're doing a good job for DFID. And I get the list that is written on the slide, which is mostly around, trainings, schemes, and obviously, tracking of women in all this, and level of payments, and some very descriptive or informative, indicators. But I was like, are you really sure that you track something that is going to give you an insight on how these schemes are going to succeed, and whether if it should be happy paying for them in the end? Well, I would like to show you the data on actually what drives sustainability. If we could go on next slide. So on next slide, I have actually two, and perhaps not best practice, but two tables for you. The left table is actually the P&L view that Tom showed you at the beginning, which is the profit and loss statement of average schemes in 2 regions of Nepal, right? Because we were like, okay, if we want to understand, how we can improve the sustainability of these schemes, we're going to look at revenues and potential to increase revenues, and we're going to look at costs and potential to reduce costs. Believe it or not, despite the fact that Oxfam is in Nepal since a long, long time, and they built probably hundreds of schemes, no one could give us the numbers. No one, right? We spent actually months to gather bits of data to try to reconstitute a database that would look half sound. Supposedly or reportedly, ADB, who had been financing 70 schemes in the country, had much better data. We went all the way to Manila to beg for that data. We didn't get it. And so
Jessica, once again, I apologize for cutting you a little short there. We'll come back to that. And that's really important, the point that you raised in terms of, the experience in Nepal. But just to keep things moving, simply because of the time allocation, we're going to move on to Mark. And Mark, to some extent, Mark, I've tried to find you on the internet, but you seem quite mysterious. That's why, especially the work around enterprise for impact. So, I know, Mark, that you were the country director for Mercy Corps in DRC, and then after that role, you went off and started a water-based enterprise, which, to be very honest with you, to get something like that to move forward, even in countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, is quite hard. So, it's absolutely amazing that you're able to put together a sustainable model like this in such a context in DRC. So we're really eager to know, to basically hear from you all about enterprise for impact.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to build on some points from the previous speakers. So just to give you a bit of a backdrop, Mercy Corps started an infrastructure project in 2008, which really started in reality, it was really put into practice in 2011. And it was really, it started off with a Food for Peace funded program, which was designed to address influx, the peri-urban increase in the city of Goma as a result of insecurity in the province. And that's what it was mainly designed to do. I came in at that point and was the country director at the time, and observed what had been happening in the DRC by the large organizations like the World Bank, GIZ and KfW, who were heavily investing in the urban and a peri-urban setting, which is a big problem obviously in cities throughout the world, throughout the developing world, but in particular in the DRC, where they're growing at a phenomenal rate. When I arrived, the population was, to give you an idea, in Goma was about 400,000. Now it's 1.5 million. So we're dealing with a big problem. However, those projects which were based on large capex investments didn't result in the improvements that obviously the donors were expecting, despite the Regideso. The Regideso is the parastatal water utility company, despite the reforms. So faced with that, and faced with NGOs that typically invest in a piecemeal way, I'd say in a more NGO traditional space, what we had to do and what we did, and one key point that Tom mentioned was time. It's taken a long time, but we've moved the. So if you can go back to the first slide, yeah, there. What we've done is we've put in a network, as you can probably see there, of lots of tap stands in a peri-urban area, and the first stage was just putting in some infrastructure, whereas the second phase, through different donors, was to put in a pilot management system. And that was in collaboration with the Regideso in a very informal NGO type of way, just to show that it could work. And it's based on the success of that second phase that we then obtained more serious funding to then have much larger CapEx investment in order to build the model that we have today. If we can move on to the next slide. I'll talk about this in a little bit. So how that was done is, although I don't want to use the word conditionality and people on the call taking that badly, but we did actually condition that well, we're only going to carry on with the third phase if if a new management system were to be put in place. When tackling making a decision like that, you're faced with big problems, mainly because you're in a country where there's only been a parastate or a national utility company with a monopoly, that there are no other really obvious alternatives. And contrary to, I mean, in certain cases, I'm sure, Jessica, there are private sector that would be willing to enter the market. In this particular case, with a lack of regulation and for many, many reasons, there are no regional or international actors willing to enter the market, even to take over large cities like Kinshasa. So what we did based on that was to do many studies. It took a long time to fight the right model. For the interest of time, I won't go from all of them, but the important thing was we were aligning and not pulling the parastatal in different directions. We're bringing unity amongst the donors, so the KfW, the World Bank, DFID, AFD, and so on, so to go in a unified direction that the Regideso also wanted to go in, or at least they say they want to go in, which is essentially disengagement, because they have 97 centres, only 3 are cost centres, which generate 85% of their revenue. So so that was so turning the other centres like Goma into profit centres was a win-win. Next slide. So what we ended up with, given that we couldn't we couldn't find, if it didn't exist, we had to create it. So what you see in front of you, you have an organisation called E4I, which is actually a non-profit registered in England and Wales, which is the 100% majority shareholder of Congo Magi, which is a local operating company which consists primarily of the people I've worked with for the last 7 years and put in place the model. And they are in a contract, a delegation contract, anyway, it's a bit unusual, directly from the Regideso. And that contract is signed by the province, because under the new law that was established 3 years ago, the province is the new contract authority. The Regideso is still in sort of legal limbo right now. So that's the model. And the results, if you can go to the next slide. This is just a slide showing that it's how we do things. It's given the corruption in the country, we've taken a very high-tech approach where everything, all the money, everything goes in and out is registered on mobile phone through a mobile network that we've developed ourselves over many years, and we have very, very tight control of the system. I think that's all I can have time to say. And just to give you, the proof is in the pudding. The next slide is that this is the contract. Going to what Jessica and Tom was saying, of course, all this was based on a financial model, which is extremely long and all negotiated, which comes down to, from which the tariff is derived, and which comes down to the cost of each party. And these are the results, the budget versus actual on our first month, which was last week. In actual fact, they're better than that. We made $11,000 profit instead of 2.8. Anyway, it wasn't a final thing. I'm sure I'm going to get lots of questions. Well, we may have time for some questions. Yes, so I'll just leave it there to stay within too many minutes. Sorry.
Mark, that was absolutely fascinating. Thanks for that. What we're going to do is, instead of taking questions now, we're going to move on to Rob. Rob's actually sitting here right next to me. Now, Rob, obviously, you know, over the last 4 to 5 years, there's been a lot of, I would say, a lot of hype. Perhaps not hype, I'm not sure, in terms of different types of capital coming in, such as impact investment capital, other types of capital coming in to basically provide some relief in terms of the challenges that we face in the development sector. Sometimes it's difficult to sort of separate the hype from the reality, but with all the different types of money flowing around, I'm really interested to know, how do you see the role of finance here? It'd be great to sort of hear. There's a lot of talk around blended.
Okay, so as a general rule about finance, don't believe the hype. Let's just go straight to a slide. So a bunch of challenges that we have talked through. Do we have the right funding instruments for the challenge? So let's just make a bit of a simple landscape here. The right funding instruments, you can break that down into a couple of dimensions. So one dimension, which on the bottom axis, the x-axis, the source of funding. Where's the money coming from? Is it private? Is it public? Or as Oscar just said, is it some sort of blend of the two? Second dimension is, well, what's the funding actually being used for? One way of thinking about that is it's a public service delivery versus private service delivery. So if you put those two axes together, a bit of a map. Let's work our way around it and see how this works. The kind of traditional, these are kind of a set of traditional ways of funding, how well they work for the kind of challenges we've been talking about. Let's start on the bottom left-hand corner, where you have private funding. So this is private commercial, quasi-commercial investment to private providers. Now, that would usually only flow if they are for profit, actually, because a private investor wants to make a return, and so they would only provide money to a private entity if there's a profit. You might want to call that a kind of wash unicorn. What do I mean by that? Well, that's a beautiful thing, right? In the sectors we're talking about, in the context we're talking about, that would be a beautiful thing to see. But like unicorns, they're pretty rare. Okay, let's keep moving around. The other way that private investment might flow in this context would be for public, delivered by the public sector. So that would be, because it's private money again, that would only be to a state-owned utility that's creditworthy. You wouldn't find private money tending to flow to a loss-making state-owned utility. So my comment there is good luck. There are very few creditworthy, profitable state-owned utilities in these sectors. As it happened, I learned tonight that here we're both in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh here, the city water utility happens to be commercially viable, and it's one of the few times I've ever heard that. I've done more work in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's very. Let's move on around to think about you'd having public funding for public sector delivery, and that's kind of business as usual, where you'd have a state-owned entity, state-owned utility, might be a municipal authority owned, for example. They just tend to be loss-making. I spend a lot of time working with various utilities, and yeah, that's the business as usual. They just keep hemorrhaging cash. So what else might you have? Well, you might have a public sector funding, sector delivery. So now we're in the bottom right quadrant of this little map. And that's really just a service contract. Now, we're in the world here of talking about market-based approaches, and it's just a contract of a private provider. That's not the kind of world we're talking about in terms of trying to tackle these problems in a way that might scale or might actually help an enterprise grow. I guess my point is, if delivery is not going to be by the public sector for the kind of challenges we're looking at, and the private sector financing options for the kind of challenging enterprises that we've been talking about, such as in Nepal or even in Kivu, then, well, what sort of financing options do you have for these kind of enterprises? I mean, as Jessica started off by saying, there's a lack of scale, the needs might be high, but the willingness to pay is low. They're not even hitting a kind of commercial break-even point. So do we have the right funding instruments? Well, no, currently, but where it gets interesting is essentially a new generation of public-private partnerships. So just to be really clear, we're not talking about outsourcing or privatization. For those who have perhaps suffered through the UK, so the private finance initiative, where it's essentially government spending but off balance sheet, we're not talking about, but we're talking about getting the best of public and private funding working together. And let me just sort of finish really by giving a specific example of what I mean in this interesting area of a new generation of PPPs. So this might be what you'd call a kind of valley of death for a social enterprise that's trying to grow and scale while remain profitable. So it's going to get to a point where it can start to bring in private capital. So it'll start, kind of dot one, and it's pretty quickly going to go cash flow negative because it's got a bunch of working capital needs and investment needs, and it has no revenue coming in. If you are an undercapitalized social enterprise with a kind of social mission around water, but an uncertain set of future financial flows, I mean, who's going to back you at that point? And the idea here is that by sequencing public and private funding in a kind of sensible way, you can kind of get through that valley of death. So I'm trying to move away from being, well, it's either one or the other, to thinking the idea of appropriate sequencing, that public money comes in and out, and private money comes in at the appropriate points. So one way to deal with this is to bring in public money, could be donor funding, for high-impact sanitation enterprises or water enterprises, in a way which generates kind of additional cash for them. And the point here is, we're not just trying to back winners, saying, oh, I'm writing a blank check. We're talking about using public money for what works. So the idea of outcomes-based funding. So if an enterprise is growing its customers and bringing in some revenue, but not covering its cost, but it's a social enterprise that has high social impact, then well, a donor can say, let's count that social impact. And that's what we're going to buy. We're going to pay for that. And that becomes a kind of cash top-up to that business. Well, it's still a business. It's not being kind of a public sector contracting for service. It's still a business being a business. But public money is being used to pay for the social impact. And that can help get that enterprise sort of through that valley of death. So and then the idea is by point 3 or 4, public money could start to taper out because the business has grown, it's got to some level of scale, and it could start to bring in first sort of frontier impact investment and then more conventional impact investment over time as the business matures. So I guess my point here is a really quite simple one. It's about getting the right flavor of money, public and private, for the right stage in the journey, and doing that in a kind of sensible way by doing it on an outcomes basis. So not just writing blank checks, but using public money really for what works. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Great. No, that's absolutely interesting, Rob. At this point, what I would like to do is stop here for a bit, let the audience digest what we've gone through, and open it up for some questions. So please feel free to send us through some questions. We'll be happy to take some of them right now.
I feel like providing some mood music while everyone's putting in some questions for us.
Yeah, go for it. So we have our first set of questions. The question is there anything about water provisions that makes these kinds of finance/delivery models good opportunities more challenging? So basically, are there anything specific to water provisions that make financing more challenging? Perhaps this is something, Tom, you might like to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in terms of looking at water provision, and especially if you compare it to something like household sanitation, where people can choose to just defecate in the open or continue with a poor choice of toilet. I mean, you need water to survive, and I think it's a myth that the poorest don't pay for water or aren't willing to pay for water. We see it everywhere. If you look in draconic Kenya, people who don't have kind of household water connections in low water town pay something like 10 times the going rate to buy water from sort of third-party vendors. Pay a huge amount to access water, so the willingness to pay is there, which I think in a way makes it a little bit easier than things like household sanitation. It's the high running costs that are associated with it that makes it a challenge.
Great, thanks, Tom. The next question, how much of this needs to be driven by donors? Is this something that should, be completely dependent on donor funding? Actually, this may be something that Jessica might feel comfortable responding to.
Yes, I thank you for directing to me. I do think that donors are a big part of the problem.
Jessica?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yeah, you're back up now.
Yes, I think there is definitely a lot of the problems are driven by donors and by the development community and the way we do things. So, I was giving this example of why do you focus solely on financing capex, and if you would put a tiny bit of that money aside to do also the opex, then there would be so much savings for and a better use of infrastructure and so much savings for everyone. And I think it's just because it's just more convenient for donors, right? They have money to spend this year and the money needs to be out of the door, and where we're going to park money for OPEX. So I didn't have the chance to show the last slide too, but it shows that the profitability of some schemes could be massively improved. Like you could, you know, make it twice as profitable by changing the way you deliver some of these schemes. So there is this traditional view that it's very good that communities dig the trenches and pay in labor for their connection, so that shows the dollar that there was some kind of local buy-in. Well, this practice has a huge cost in terms of subsequent OPEX costs, because piping is typically too shallow and poorly done when, you know, the community dig the trenches. And on those schemes where the community has dug the trenches, piping costs go through the roof, right? So it's just like, if somebody would bother doing the math and looking at the facts, perhaps we should realize that we should get away from some of these practices that are so-called, you know, like driving local ownership. You know, this is all this, you know, this mythology by the development community, which is completely unfounded and sometimes counterproductive.
So, yeah, can I just jump in as well? My take on it perhaps a little bit more generously than Jessica, but up for discussion. There's absolutely a role for the traditional donors, and for one of the questions around ODA, because that money doesn't demand, you know, talking about the title of this webinar, doesn't demand an ROI from businesses that are kind of not yet ready to give an ROI. So there's absolutely a role. But as Jessica pointed out, my frustration is often the aid money is simply used incredibly inefficiently, or worse, it can really create some distortions. So as Jessica's pointed out, skewing towards CapEx spending, building stuff, essentially, rather than thinking about results and outcomes that you're trying to get with that money. So if you're thinking about outcomes, say, well, it's not just about building stuff, it's about building and maintaining stuff. So maybe we spend less on CapEx and more on OPEX, and that'll be a sustained system that people can use over time, and that'll lead to results. It's a more efficient way of using aid money. So yes, a role, but it needs to be used more intelligently.
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Rob. There's another question here, and the question is there a way of ensuring that ROI considers the social return on investments? There could be projects that have low ROI but large SROI, and vice versa. So, for example, I think this question is perhaps you know, something Rob, you can tackle, because I think that's what you were saying.
Let's give Mark here, because I think Mark's a perfect example of a business that has a very high social return on investment.
Absolutely, Mark. Mark, the question is basically, is there a way of ensuring that ROI considers social return on investment? There could be projects that have low ROI but large SROI, and vice versa.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that I've got a bit of a problem with how private investment is, you know, when we're talking about public and private. If large amounts of capex are going in from the public purse, I think the question should be, well, you know, to what extent should then, you know, to what extent should a private company then exploit that, particularly in a fragile state where there's very little regulation, and exactly, you know, to deliver the social returns that we're looking at. So in our model, if probably people couldn't, you know, get my presentation very well, but we have a DRC incorporated company, but it belongs to a non-profit company in the UK. So essentially, it's a social enterprise. So I think you know, it's very important, going to linking this to the previous question, that when we're looking at the capex and the opex, I think that the opex, the capex should be driven by the business plan of the OPEX in the first place. I think it's very damaging to invest in CapEx if you can't manage the system afterwards. In a sense, what is the point in building a system that can't be managed sustainably or has no chance of being run sustainably? That's been always the case in the DRC for many decades, and the government gets used to that sort of thing. The parastatal gets used to these freebies, and there's very little accountability. So I think that we have to actually be starting to be much tougher on getting the results. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get a fantastic ROI. You know, if we take the time and the investment required to put a contract together, to put a public-private partnership together, I've worked relentlessly on this with my team for 4 years. The value of the 15-year contract that we're ended up with, some professionals have said that, you know, it's worth 5-6 million just there. So those are the sorts of costs that need to be where the donor has a very key role to play. But it has to have vision from the start. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
At least
yeah.
some.
In addition to that,
Go ahead.
Sorry, I have no problem. That's right. I do have a problem with very high IRRs, rates of return for private investors. I have a problem with that in all cases because it implies an inefficient market. But I don't really have a problem with a kind of relatively small rate of return for private investment. You're talking about social investment, I'm not talking about JP Morgan Asset Management. I have a problem with that because in some cases there may not be an alternative source of funding, or not a source of funding that's actually well suited to that kind of social enterprise. You might have a donor trying to give it a grant and making it do certain things, and actually that's not really in the spirit of what business is trying to do. So there may be a good reason to have that flavor of funding for that particular enterprise. But if there's essentially a rate of return to the private investment from the public sector, that can only be justified if there's significant social impact as a result of what that enterprise is doing. So I think you can square the circle a bit. So I don't have a problem per se with some level of rate of return to private investment if it's alongside significant social impact, or as the question says, significant social ROI.
Great.
So sorry, I just want to say I agree with that, but I'm talking specifically about a case in the DRC and you know, in fragile states where if a company makes a private investment, I totally agree with you, but often they make marginal investments and reap the benefit from the large public purse capex investments that are made. The Régie des Eaux would be a perfect example of that, and I could give you really detailed, relatively detailed you know, statistics on probably what they've taken out of, you know, previous investments made.
Yeah, and that would be essentially rent seeking, which again is kind of inefficient use of capital. Agree.
Great. Actually, yeah. So as we're nearing the end of the session here, Mark, we wanted to. I think you've kind of answered some of those questions already, but we wanted to sort of ask you about your experience in your context in terms of you know, the challenges that you faced in terms of funding, and what has been your journey so far, and how you sort of, you know, your experience in that particular fragile context.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I think that what I have to say is that from the beginning, where we're ended up now is more out of accident from, you know, there was no one at the beginning of the humanitarian intervention who thought that we would be where we are today. So it's been very much a case of adaptive management, and then from a relatively early stage, understanding really the problem and where we wanted to go. So I would say that with the traditional donors, if we were talking to Food for Peace in 2010 or 2011, the idea that their funding would actually result in the first public-private partnership in the DRC would not have resonated. Really, the focus was on, oh, let's build a high-performance parastatal in the DRC, which of course the World Bank and KfW have been cracking away at that for many decades, with hundreds of millions invested and without obtaining the result. So the funding was really, the way we did it was to start with one small thing and then make the case under a different funding streams, which was through the European Commission and a different GPAF, to then go to put more infrastructure in, selling it on along the lines that they were interested at the time, whilst at the same time putting in a pilot, telling them, well, we need to improve the management as well and that type of thing. And so we needed to get to the point where we could actually have a successful model. Now, once that happened, and which, by the way, was relatively easy in a sense to put in place because no one really believed in it, no one understood it, and it worked it worked instantaneously. So we're at one point, 40 Born Fontaines tap stands were generating a quarter of the revenue of Régie des Eaux in a city like Goma. Once that became apparent, it was then a platform to then leverage traditional, like a mainstream donor in a much bigger way. But again, not selling the partnership for the reasons that Jessica and probably and others have mentioned, is that you can't go too far too soon. You need to say, well, we'll look at the options. We're fine. You need to go through all of the options and then generate the reports that indicate that your route is the most successful route. So it really is a time. You really have to. It requires a lot of perseverance. We need to find the right staff. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is keeping a team together for 7 or 8 years in order to get from A to B. And then now we're at a phase where things are looking just great, because, well, now that you've got a fully functional model in place when the results are coming through, then I would say that the next step would be probably getting substantial capex investment, probably through the World Bank or other donors, and then blending that finance with some loan, some very cheap loan, some almost interest-free loan, and getting much more of a blended finance thing going. We've got some foundation money already, but yeah. So I think, to try and plan this with the existing funding streams, you're not going to write a project proposal, I don't think, of this nature from day one and find the perfect donor. Although there are, I think donors are coming around a bit, so watch the space.
Great, thanks for that, Mark. Great, for me, that's great learning in terms of sort of how to perhaps put together programs in the future where we have to take a much longer term perspective. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, we've come towards the end of our session, and at this point, I would like to hand it over to Tom, our senior WASH advisor for Oxfam, to sort of for a brief wrap-up session. Tom.
So thanks for everyone for your inputs on this. I know it was a lot of information coming from a lot of different angles, but it's kind of representative of how we've been tackling these problems. I mean, just to kind of wrap up, I think that, there was the question about donors and the role of donors. Yes, I think that funding needs to be structured in a way that really drives investment in sustainable outcomes. Jessica touched on this payment by results model, which I think we all know is not really getting the job done. I mean, we're working with Rob and social finance on an outcomes funding model for water the moment. So, you know, how can we actually get funders to sort of incentivize investment in last mile water systems and invest in things like sustainability, equity, inclusion, and put a financial incentive behind it, actually. Jessica's completely, basically disproven a lot of the assumptions that we had around water system viability in Nepal, and really made us rethink kind of how and where we invest. And we're already kind of putting that in place at the moment. So, I mean, that finding that, you know, having people kind of get buy-in by digging their own trenches and putting in their own pipes. I mean, the pipe repair costs are off the charts. We're completely throwing that out the window and looking at where we're investing. And it's more in things like centralized account management and how to drive down admin. You know, I think an interesting finding from that is what's the size of scale, and we need to actually prove that, or to bring in the right partners. And it's not 3 systems, it's not 5 systems. It's 180 systems. So that's the pilot right there. I think, and then Mark, I know Oxfam DRC is looking at how we can link up to Kangamaji and link some of our more rural water service providers into that enterprise that's being developed. Now, that is going to be a slow process, but Mark, for me, is really someone who I think is someone inspiring for kind of proving that no, places like Eastern Congo, these types of difficult places, don't have to get stuck with sort of poor quality service. Yeah, so a lot of exciting opportunities for us with these partners.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Sam. With that, we would like to conclude the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It was great to have you, and we look forward to having you in our next session. Once again, thank you, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.